Hello, everyone. Welcome to Growing Web3. I'm super excited to have with me today Jake Stott, the founder of Hype, prolific angel investor and successful SaaS entrepreneur. So I've been lucky enough to work with Jake for the last 2 years, growing Hype, and I thought it'd be awesome to get him on the show as he's going to be a co-host and start hosting some episodes of Growing Web3 over the coming weeks and months. So super excited for that. So, Jake, I thought maybe we could kick off by learning a little bit about your journey into Web3.
Yeah, thanks, James. Obviously, a bit of a strange one, you interviewing me for the podcast, but I'm excited to, be doing some more hosting over the coming months, getting some great guests on. So thanks for having me on, I guess, for this. But yeah, like, how did I get into Web3? So my background really is I've been in the space since 2017, like a lot of people of the last era of crypto. And I got into the space because basically I'd missed out on being involved in Ethereum in the early days. So back in late 2014, I went to some of the early Ethereum meetups in Berlin, invited by a friend, told me I had to go and see this thing. Really impressive, like super smart people. But the main thing is I just didn't really understand it at the time. So completely skipped a few years and didn't decide to get more involved and didn't really understand what was actually happening. And then in 2017, a friend of mine sent me a message, and I'd actually posted the Ethereum white paper on Facebook in 2014. Don't really know why, but at some point I'd done that. He found that Facebook post, reached out to me in 2017, and then I realized like how much I'd really missed. And how much money I hadn't made from investing in the Ethereum ICO. So the next, within days, I was in Athens at the time, and then like 3 days later, I was back in Berlin, and decided to jump into the rabbit hole basically. And that was the beginning. At the time, I was running a marketing agency, working with e-commerce companies, so doing all sorts of digital marketing. And then throughout the year of 2017, was spending 12 hours a day at least. It was very intense. Getting involved in ICOs, kind of like investing in crypto, like being a true retail investor in the space, and then just became quite obsessed and realized there was a big opportunity to use the skills I had and to work with crypto companies, which are now Web3 companies, I guess, instead of working with e-commerce companies. It was more fun. There wasn't that many people doing it. There were some like agencies and some people doing it, but generally it just felt like a whole new area to explore. And then that was the beginning really. So since beginning of December 2017, I started taking on my first crypto clients for marketing. And then over the last 5.5 years, we've worked with 230 plus companies in the space. So yeah, and kind of unexpected.
Amazing. Yeah, 230 is an insane number of projects and companies to work with. So from working with all of those, crypto, I guess now Web3 startups, organizations, what do you think are the key things that makes launching a Web3 startup different from launching a Web2 startup?
Yeah, so I think one thing I would say is that like comes up a lot is like people ask this on Twitter all the time. A lot of people, or when I've been on other podcasts, I think people are quite obsessed with the differences between Web2 and Web3. So everybody's like, what's different about Web3? Like, why is it completely different to Web2? And to be honest, it's not completely different, right? And I think this is almost like a cloud that is, of mystery that is over Web3. But at the end of the day, like marketing is marketing. And if you need to launch a project, then basically you need to get out there. You need to find like who's your key audience, who are the different kinds of stakeholders you need to get involved, and how are you going to get them interested in your product or whatever else you might be doing, right? And that applies to like boomer marketing from like the 60s with like Ogilvy, doing like ads for soap, as much as it applies to apps from say Web2, as it applies to like crypto projects now. So I think marketing is marketing. I think what you have to think about in terms of launching a Web3 company over launching a Web2 company is one key thing is that you are, especially if you have a token anyway, you are a public company from very, very early in your life. And I think the average sort of Silicon Valley Web2 founder has essentially, quite a lot of privilege that they get to remain a private company. They get to fail. They get to make loads of mistakes behind the scenes. Whereas as a crypto company, you are public from day one or near enough. And that is a huge difference that not everybody's prepared for. So I think that's the number one thing, like knowing you are a public company. And you have to behave more like a company listed on the stock market than you do a Silicon Valley startup often. That's one thing. The second key thing is if you have a token, which, there's Web3 companies that don't, but let's assume most of them do, then you're going to need a community. And if your token or if your general ecosystem around that token is not interesting to normal people at all, or has no purpose, then there's a high chance that basically your project's not going to be successful. So there are examples right now, there's examples of meme tokens that in a way don't really have any use either, but they manage to capture some mind share, but there's also examples of very corporate blockchains that, we've seen, or often niche use cases like that haven't managed to build a community because that's not really the point. They see it, they see their token as more of too fixed on like the token economics rather than whether the community cares about it. So I think that's the second thing really, is that you need to be thinking about like, where is what are you building, and is it interesting for a specific community, and can you build a community around it? So that's the second thing. And then I think the third point is really looking at what are you actually trying to build, really. So if you look at a typical Web2 company, like the only real mechanism, or the thing of interest is profit. All right, so you need to make more profit, you need to make more recurring revenue, and hopefully over your lifetime of going through seed, Series A and beyond, IPO maybe, or a sale, you are making more profit, and you are increasing, recurring revenue or something like that. So that's a typical Web2 company. Web3 companies don't really have that. I mean, some of them do make fees, and so if they're a DEX or if they're a layer one, like sometimes they make money from gas fees, or they make money from transaction fees, or from users. But there's also a lot of projects in the space that don't really have that when you really look at it. I mean, there's a lot of tokens that, if you're looking at it from a purely fundamental, Warren Buffett kind of mindset, that they don't make sense at all, but they still happen to be multi-billion-dollar companies. So the question is why and how? And I think there are lots of other mechanisms at play that sort of drive value in this space. On the far end, meme tokens being one of that, one of those things really that they don't really make any sense, but like if they capture mindshare, then they have value. So I think that's a third thing about launching a company. Like it doesn't have to be super profitable to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it. Like you have to have demand from somewhere. And for some reason, there's a lot of demand for memes, just in general. People love memes, people love meme coins, and there's demand for that in the market. So yeah, and it's funny that there's more demand for some meme coins than, projects you would think are maybe have more utility. But yeah,
and I think
that's the space.
Another example of that is also, in some ways looking at NFTs. So, a lot of NFT projects launched and they were like, we're going to have all this utility. And even now, like 1 or 2 years later, a lot of them don't necessarily have all the utility they promised, but they still have value. They still have a strong community. They're still doing things. So I think it's just kind of a different mindset. Is that, if one of my dad's friends asked me like, yeah, but why is this worth anything? And sometimes it's not, but and sometimes these projects die off, but a lot of them are going to live for the next decade. And if you only think about it in sort of traditional business mindsets, then basically you're not going to get it, and you're going to miss out on a lot of opportunity. So I think, the old rules have been kind of thrown out, and there are kind of, if you can capture mind share, if you can build an audience and a community and make people feel like they're part of something, you can drive value.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So switching up slightly, I wanted to talk about Incubate, which is a new initiative launched alongside Hype. And Incubate is a Web3 incubator focused on go-to-market strategies. I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about Incubate and how it can support founders.
Yeah, cool. So we've just launched Incubate a few months ago. It's been, I'd say, in the works for close to a year, really, in terms of planning and thinking about like what our offering is in the market. So what we've seen over the last few years, probably since sort of 2019 onwards, is there's a lot of accelerators, like Web3 accelerators, it generally accelerators as well. So I'll do also very quickly, what's the difference between a venture studio, an incubator, and an accelerator? Because they're three different terms that are thrown around a lot. So venture studio is, generally speaking, it's a small group or collective of people, and they are building their own ideas. So they might have an idea for a product, they build it, and then they spin it out as a separate company. And you maybe, as a venture studio, can do a small amount. You can do maybe a few a year or whatever it might be, but you're creating new companies and it's your idea and everything like that. So that's a venture studio. An accelerator is the other end of the spectrum. So an accelerator is companies that already exist, startups that already exist. They come to you and you provide sort of a low touch kind of service. So it might be mentoring, it might be specific areas that you focus on. And then at the end, your goal is to help improve the company as an accelerator, and then do a demo day and do some introductions to investors. But accelerators, they are kind of essentially like VCs. They're looking to do 20 or 50 projects in a cohort. Y Combinator is essentially this, but the most successful. And then the goal is that some of them will be successful and some will fail. That's the nature of just VC investing. Right, so that's the two ends of the spectrum, and in the middle is an incubator. And an incubator is, finding either external founders or external projects that already exist, and then really working with them very closely. So doing a smaller amount than an accelerator, but maybe a bigger amount than a venture studio, and working with them closely. And whatever you might focus on, it might be everything, and bringing them to market and giving them a higher chance of success. So as an incubator, you want to have a higher hit ratio of success than an accelerator. Otherwise, you're probably failing. But at the same time, you might not have as high hit ratio as a venture studio. It's hard to say, but it's somewhere in the middle. Right? So why are we doing Incubate? Well, what we've seen is there aren't that many incubators within Web3 anyway. There's actually quite a lot of venture studios, like some really good ones like Thesis. But then, or VenturePunk is another great one. But then the other end, there's a lot of accelerators as well. So you have, Outlier Ventures, you have Beacon, which is sort of a new one related to some of the early Polygon team. You have Longhash, and there's probably quite a few others. You could say A16Z also have their own to some extent. And that's, let's just call it factory production. It's the high volume. And then there's the very low volume of venture studio. And in the middle, where we want to be is, the incubation side. So our experience over the last few years is that there are not many places for founders to go and get very, deep, like a deep level of service. And for founders to work with people very, very closely. Like VCs sometimes will do that if they're invested enough, but most of the time, they're not. They're mostly there to provide capital. Accelerators as well, they will have some successful projects, but if you are not the best project in the cohort, then you might get left behind to some extent. So sometimes you're missing something there. And really, that's not really what an accelerator is aiming to do. They're aiming to do as many projects as possible rather than work closely with a handful. So we've seen these problems from, working with different accelerators and different ecosystems in the space. And that's been, a huge area where we think that we could, improve. So I think that's the first part. The second part is the ecosystems themselves. So Web3 is obviously split into like Bitcoin and Ethereum at the top, mostly sort of, Ethereum is for building other dApps on top of. And then now we've got a list of, 70 plus ecosystems that most people have maybe heard of. And all of them need to grow. So all of them need dApps building there. And the way I think of these is like in the mobile phone market, you have operating systems. So, a blockchain is like an operating system to some extent. You have iOS and you have Android. And in the mobile world, they're the only two real operating systems. And you have the Google Play Store and is it the iTunes Store, the Apple Store? And they're really the only two places where you can build if it's a mobile phone app. And in the Web3 space, you now have 70 blockchains, or there's probably more, but you have a lot of blockchains. So all of these are their own competing app stores to some extent. And all of them need to find dApps. Many of these are sort of like a growing stage or an early stage. So they need accelerators, they need incubators to sort of help bring these teams to market. So for some of the bigger blockchains, to name like our first partner, Polygon, they have thousands of dApps. They have a lot of people building in their ecosystem. But in our opinion, what they need to do next is find, those 10 killer dApps. They need to find the 10 dApps that are each going to have 1 million users or more that are comparable to the top downloaded apps on the App Store. And that's really where we want to come in. So if you're trying to incubate 50 projects at a time or accelerate 50 projects at a time, it's going to be hard to find those big winners or really work closely with them to help it happen. We're going to be working with 8 projects at a time, and we'll be working closely with the ecosystems to find out what are the best projects and then really help them get to that, super dApp type stage. So that's what we're doing with Incubate. We just announced our first cohort with Polygon and working with projects within that ecosystem. And we'll have more to come, over the next few months as we kind of build everything out.
Epic. Very, very cool. So we did a few office hours with the group of founders early on in the Incubate community, which has been growing really fast, which is awesome to see. And there were lots of common questions that I thought we could kind of chat about on this recording.
Yeah, cool.
As lots of founders will be listening in. So, as we already touched on community and the importance of it, if a founder of a new project wants to start to grow their community, or how should they go about kicking off growing a community around their project? What are the first steps, and what advice do you have?
Yeah, so always the most difficult part, really, the beginning of a community. Honestly, there's a few ways to go about it. All right? But I think the key thing that I've said to a lot of founders within Incubate already is you need to find those multipliers. Right? So if you've got no community, it's a bit like when if you look at a social media profile as well. You can post all day long on Twitter. You could post 100 tweets a day for the next month, and you're probably not going to grow that much unless you manage to come up with something either by chance goes viral, or you're kind of talking about a topic that everybody's talking about right now. So there are different ways to do it. But if you're just tweeting away, you could do thousands of tweets and not make much progress. So same with the community. If you open a community and the team is just talking in there and there's a few, your friends are in there, it doesn't, especially because it doesn't have an external outlet. Like Twitter, there are millions of people there on that platform. So people might come across you. With the community, it's a closed, siloed space. So you could all be chatting there 24 hours a day, and doesn't mean anyone else is ever going to find it. So that's a kind of key problem that we find in the beginning. So you need to find these multipliers. Who are the people, like what is your community for? And who are the people who might want to be there? So if it is a community for, let's just pick a random thing, within the space. So it could be like crypto traders within Turkey, right? So it's a specific Turkish language crypto trader group, right? So if you start that on day one, who's going to join it, right? So you've got to think about who has access to that audience, right? So where do I find crypto traders within Turkey, right? So thinking out loud, like some of the areas you might look at. Who are the biggest crypto exchanges in Turkey? Probably most of those traders trade there. Like, can you reach out to people working there? Can you partner with them, for example? Like, that's a multiplier because they have access to the audience that you want, right? Same might be crypto traders on Twitter, who speak in Turkish. They also are potential multipliers. Maybe they've got an audience of those people. So when you want to start a community, you have to think about like who you're trying to bring in. If it's art collectors, if it's traders, if it's, photographers, whatever it could be, any type of community, crypto or not, you need to find those multipliers who do have that audience already and try and find a way to work with them, right? And in some cases, it might be paid, right? Like sometimes you have influencers it works at, but most of the time you don't really need to do that in the beginning. I think you just got to find ways to leverage their audience, and then that should give you your first 1,000 community members maybe, and then from there, you kind of build from that and find out like where the most successful paths are.
Awesome. Super great advice. Super great advice. I'm always telling founders that you shouldn't try and the goal shouldn't be to have a large community, right? It's a good comparison with like a social media profile. You shouldn't aim to have a really big social media profile. Like at the end of the day, it's just a vanity metric. Like you should aim to have a really engaged community, just like a really engaged social media profile is more important than a huge one. And I think that's kind of tough for founders because they kind of compare themselves to other communities and we go, oh my God, this person, this team has like 50,000 people in their Discord. And it's like, yeah, but go into their Discord and look at like, is the engagement good? Is the quality of the conversation high? And with these, huge Discords, often the case is that the quality of engagement and conversation is not that high. And so it's much better to have a Discord with under 1,000 people or a few hundred people that has really good engagement, and where people are like, yeah, active and happy and, everyone's really connecting versus just a lot of kind of people in there for the wrong reasons. I think one question which was asked to me was like, how active should founders be in their community like early on? So yeah, do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, on that as well, it's not, I don't think the community should always stay small. Like, I think, you do get to a point if you are like one of the bigger projects where you are just naturally going to have maybe tens of thousands of people, maybe even millions of people in your community. But yeah, like that shouldn't be the goal in the beginning. And if you can keep a smallish community that is very active for at least the first few months that you're kind of building, you're going to learn a lot, right? And I'm in so many Discords and Telegram groups that I've been in for a long time, and I'm not active in most of them, is a reality. Like I'm technically in the community as one of the numbers, but I'm not active. It's because, there might be 10,000 people in there or 50,000 people in there. And, I don't know anybody. I'm just a complete anonymous person in a group of 50,000. If you're in a channel of 100 people and, a good amount of them are active, then you're maybe more incentivized to be active. And the communities I'm most active in are more that kind of size, in the hundreds. So I think that's a very important thing because you do need those core fans. And you find that common problem with like early stage projects is they go for this 10,000 or 50,000 size group, and then nobody feels like they're really part of anything. And in the end, people start to fade away, and you haven't built this core community of maybe several hundred or 1,000 people. So I think that's yeah, that's really an important point that you make there. What was the other thing you said, actually? What was the question you asked?
How involved should founders be? So, I mean, at the beginning, I'll give you my answer, and then you can tell me if you agree or not. But I think, at the beginning, I think it's important for founders to be involved. But over time, the community obviously should, in the spirit of Web3 and decentralization, the community, the power, the voice should obviously, become, should spread between all the different members. But yeah, it can be hard, I think, for founders early on when they first, have a Discord and they've got notifications on for every message and they're trying to answer everything. It can be a bit nuts. And then some founders don't really engage at all. So yeah, wondering where you think the balance is for like early stage founders.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like the same. Honestly, that's the same in like Web2. It's like you always hear stories, of VC saying, the best founders are the ones who go and, they spend all their 80% of the time speaking to customers and, finding out like what their problems are. And I think it's true, in this space as well. If you were to go through the top 50 projects, I would say most of them, the founders are kind of public figures and they're kind of known.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been like, if they're maybe not as active anymore because they're too big, but they've been active or they're active on Twitter or something. So I do think you kind of have to build up that relationship with people in the beginning, and it's important to do that. However, I also don't think it's the only way, right? And one way to supplement that quite quickly is essentially having a very good sort of head of community, which is one of the hardest positions to hire in the whole space. Right? There's just not that many people out there who really can do it on a high level. There's a lot of community managers, but the really, really good ones are in short supply or they're very expensive. But they can quickly sort of supplant founders. So if you have someone who just is super active and, one of the best right now, he's not a community manager as such, he is sort of technically a founder, but he's not the CEO, right? Which I think is actually quite important, is Frank from DGods, like the big NFT project, probably top 5. He's technically not the CEO of the company, even though he sort of founded it. And the CEO is sort of running all business operations, is kind of behind the scenes a bit more. But Frank is the person out front and center. So I don't know what he calls himself, his actual title, but in some ways he's also head of community. And if you can find that kind of character who can be there the whole time, like the founders maybe can take a bit of a step back, or if it's not really your personality, it's possible.
Cool. Super cool. Another important thing, and we discuss this a lot when we think about like where the space is going. And we discussed it just before we started recording also this like idea of the meta game, which is based on a post from Kobe that everyone should read. It's on his Substack. So yeah, just quickly, the meta game is like, what's the bigger game that we're playing and what are the rules of that bigger game and how does that fit into, the narratives that evolve in the space. So we started to talk about narratives a little bit, and yeah, for early stage founders, I think narratives are super important. So yeah, would love to hear how you think early stage founders should approach like building a narrative around their project and how they can communicate that.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that more and more people are realizing is important. I think for 2 to 3 years, in the beginning in 2017, 2018, most people ignored this, I think, as like, or even called it the narrative. They just did something, they did an ICO. And then, I think some of the smartest people kind of realized this, maybe 2019, 2020, that there was like narratives. Narratives mostly being like trends, so like key trends, and like the meta game being like, what's the current trend or what's the upcoming trend? And I think now a lot of founders do realize, okay, like there's trends and you kind of have to play into that. If you're building something that's kind of old news now, or you don't fit into a trend. So an example, right? And this isn't a diss at all, but there was a period, actually for 2 blockchains that I can think of, there was a very big Polkadot period. right? Which was, I think, the sort of second half of 2020. It was like the end of, I think the dot token was released in the second half of 2020. Things went crazy. And for a while, every project had pink branding and was called Poker something, right? And there was this huge, that was definitely the trend at that point in time. So if you were launching a project, like in that moment, every project wanted to be called Poker something and have pink branding. And loads of those projects are still around. Then I think, some point soon after that, like it was sort of 6 months later, there was Solana. So every project came out. It had this blue, purpley, green Solana gradient colors, and it was called Sol something. And there was a big Solana trend, right? And that's not as big right now. It's not that it won't come back, but like, every especially ecosystems have their phases or different kind of things. There was also DeFi 2.0 or yield farming was before that. It was like the first part, so yield farming or fair launches was a big trend, right? So you can't always predict the next trend. It's very hard to say what they're going to be, but it is very clear right now that there's probably 5 to 10 trends you and me could name that are probably going to happen at some point in the next 2 to 3 years. When they happen and how it all happens, we don't really know. So as a founder, you can either choose, right? Like, so to give it right now, you could choose to call yourself Poker, blah, 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 and launching the Polkadot ecosystem. Or, there's been the hype of the last month or so, the Arbitrum side of things, and call yourself Arb something, right? And anyone who's listening to this can probably guess which of them is more on trend right now, and which is maybe the smart move. So I do think founders, they have to be thinking about that. Like, you might prefer another technology solution. You might prefer lots of different things about, a different ecosystem. But you've also got to be thinking about a trend that's coming up. And it's much better to build for the next trend than the trend that's already happened, and that's, there can be some overlap. It could just be a small tweak, but otherwise, you might be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, projects can also maneuver, based on narratives to find like product market fit, or at least to find more demand for their solution within the market. There have been some projects which have focused on privacy and then moved to like when new technologies have evolved, they might adopt those new technologies, like ZK. Applications are becoming very popular. A lot of those founders previously worked on different types of privacy tech with their startups. And I think that's one thing actually I think that is really important for founders is that they must have some understanding of like the widest meta in the space to be successful. It's like the best founders seem to have this like, they've got this like peripheral vision of like what's going on. I remember Kane from Synthetics wrote a tweet thread or an article about like Web3, we're trying new things all the time and there are so many failed experiments, but every time we're doing it, like we're improving, like the failed experiments are getting better and better. And you can kind of look back and you can see all of that and it's really obvious. So like, there's no point launching something that's, from an experiment that was done 6 months ago and failed. Like you've got all the current, everything that's current is, and what's going to happen next is where you should be looking. That's how you should be thinking about building.
Yeah, and to comment on that, so there's one idea really, that's the same idea, and here's 3 different iterations of it over the last 5 years. So iteration 1 is, it was maybe an ICO in 2017 or 18 for a social network type, play. And the idea is that lots of people would join and there would be a token behind everything and people could earn those tokens and then they would spend them in shops. There would be like a loyalty point scheme and they would go around spending these tokens, buying their Starbucks or buying like, I don't know, restaurant food or whatever, right? So that was stuff we saw a lot in 2017, 2018. I could probably dig out some names. All of them failed, right? And it didn't work at all. They were some of like the biggest, fails really at that time, but they raised a lot of money. Second iteration we've seen over the last couple of years has been incorporating NFTs into that. So, people earn NFTs and those NFTs can be used to redeem certain things. But the idea is essentially a social network. But now people have incorporated NFTs and maybe brought in creators or brands or whatever, and brands have been more interested in that because they kind of have understood the NFT. So there's quite a lot of these types of projects right now. Some have failed, but some of them are still going, and they've raised money and they're like working their way through it, and maybe they find a path through. The third iteration of that is what we're starting to see in decentralized social. So it's a social media thing, and it could have a lot of elements of the first example I gave, but now all of the data is collected on chain. It sort of removes big tech from the equation, or big social media platforms. You own your data. And then people are building sort of different front ends and different experiences. So this is still pretty early. You have Lens and Farcaster and a bunch of other stuff. But that's like the same idea that we've now seen, like a third, to some extent the same idea, but like the slight, it's got a slightly different feature set, or it's using a slightly different aspect. And I actually think this third iteration of this, we will actually see some success stories. Like we'll see, we've already got like examples of, Lens probably has a few million users, or maybe 1 million users already, I would guess.
I think, yeah. I think actually they don't have that many users, maybe like 400,000, but the engagement's crazy high because they made it really hard to get a profile.
Yeah.
Maybe they're up to 1 million.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think
Cool.
It's not giant, it's definitely not going to take down Twitter just yet, but at the same time, it does have a critical mass. Like it definitely has some kind of functionality that could grow.
Absolutely.
So I think it doesn't mean that like past ideas are bad, but it's that, you've got to kind of get it, you've got to catch it at the right time, and timing is, one of the main things. So yeah.
Timing is extremely important in this space. That's for sure. So next question, which channels should early stage founders focus on? What marketing channels?
It's going to depend a bit on your project, to be honest, but the most important thing that I see time and time again is when I speak to early stage projects, you go on their website. This is the same with any type of company, same as Web2 companies. You go on their website and they have a footer, and it has 6 different social media profiles. It has a Medium, it has a Twitter, an Instagram, a Snapchat, an email button, and all this stuff. So I didn't actually, someone else told me this in the past, and I just repeat this a lot, but I think it's very good, is that focus on 1 or 2 channels in the beginning and really nail them, right? Until you're scaling that, and you're very, very happy with it, and you think they're doing well, don't even look at a 3rd channel or beyond that. And the problem that you see is you end up with like 6 channels. 3 of them are complete ghost towns. The other 3 you're struggling to kind of keep up, and none of them are really like optimized. So yeah, focus on 1 or 2 channels. Those 1 or 2 channels in crypto are generally wherever you decide to build your community, which right now the default is generally Discord, and probably Twitter. And beyond that, like unless you really, if you're doing a corporate blockchain type play, then maybe you want to do LinkedIn. If you're doing something that's targeting creators or gamers or whatever, then maybe you want to look at Twitch, or you want to look at Instagram, depending. But generally speaking, Discord and Twitter are just the simplest place. And I think that could change in the next couple of years. Like Twitter is changing quite a lot, obviously with the Elon purchase, and Discord, people find it frustrating. And we've seen, when I started in 2017, a lot of projects had Slack channels or Slack groups. That moved quickly to Telegram, and then those Telegram groups have moved to Discord. And now I feel like there could be room for something else, but we haven't found it yet. So yeah.
Maybe it's going to be Lens. Maybe it's going to be Web3 social. That'd be cool.
Yep.
That'd be super cool. Okay, next question. So this is something that we hear a lot, right? It's founders, projects come to us when they're thinking about launching a token. So maybe their product is working, they have some early users, or maybe they don't, and they're thinking of launching a token. How should founders think about, firstly, how should founders think about launching a token? And then what should be like their general approach to actually building a campaign around launching a token?
So to touch on how should founders think about launching a token? So things change quite a lot on that front as well. So we've also seen many iterations of like how to launch a token. So 2017 was ICOs. The cool thing about ICOs, which I still think is cool now, is that they were a bit more democratic and more people could get involved. But then it became quite clear that maybe they are closer to financial assets, and that became heavily regulated. So on that side, things changed. Then we've had IEOs, and then we've had IDOs, initial exchange offerings, initial decentralized exchange offerings. Right now, the big trend is airdrops. So a lot of big projects doing airdrops, really based on activity and people contributing to a community or to a product. And then I think we're going to see, so the airdrop thing as well, very hot right now. I think will be a trend for the rest of this year, but it's going to also evolve and maybe change a bit, and we might see different kinds of mechanisms. So why do people do any of these types of initiatives at all? It's generally because if you are a founder, you need to kind of think like, how do I incentivize my community to be involved? Right. So that's what is the first question is, okay, how can I build a community? And beyond just like marketing and creating a place for people to feel at home, you also want to incentivize them. And that's why a lot of the big projects have done well, is that people have been incentivized early, and a lot of people have benefited, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you as a founder need to think about that. And you might have VC investors, or you might have private investors who've invested, and they're obviously incentivized. But if you cannot capture a wider community than just your investors, potentially even at launch, there's a very high chance you're going to fail. And we saw a lot of companies over the last couple of years, like quite a few, who said, no, we're not going to do a public sale, or we're not going to distribute any tokens to our community through an airdrop or anything. And to be honest, I can't think of many of them that are still really around or doing that well. Like most of those companies who made that call probably are not doing well right now, I would guess. Then on the opposite end, we have companies like Uniswap, who did like probably the biggest and most famous airdrop maybe ever. And Uniswap did really well. Everybody kind of was already using the product, but then at the same time, everybody then had sort of, in a way, a stake, and it's not exactly like that, but they felt like they were part of it, and they were incentivized, to help the whole organization grow or the product grow. So I think founders need to think, okay, what is the way I can get the biggest amount of distribution, and then also keep people incentivized to sort of like be involved long term, not just get tokens and then sell them, which is what a lot of people do. And there isn't really one answer to that. But generally, the trend that's happened over a period of time is that you used to be able to just buy tokens and do what you want with them. And now the trend is a bit more, projects look at like, okay, who has contributed to my community? Like, who's contributed to my product? Like, who's actually helped us get to this stage? And how can we keep those people involved, because they've already, contributed so far? And that's a general wider just thought, okay, get people interested in doing things, and then reward them for that work they've done, and try and do that on the biggest scale possible, I think.
Awesome. Super great answer. So quickly, a couple quick fire questions. Can you give me 3 companies that you think do great marketing? They don't have to be companies we've worked with.
3 crypto companies, yeah?
Yeah, 3 crypto companies.
I think Ethereum does great marketing, even though they probably don't realize it. But I think they do great marketing by not doing any marketing, and that appeals to developers and it appeals to purists in a way. Vitalik is probably one of the best marketers in this space, but he doesn't try to be, and people love him for that. So I think they're pure. They're, at least by most people's standards, Ethereum's kind of pure in like the way they behave. So that's a very difficult start to replicate. Let's think, who else does great marketing? I think quite a few of the VCs are starting to do great marketing, and we're seeing that more and more. So in a way, the VC game is as competitive as the token game now, or just like crypto projects themselves. VCs have to try and get in there on the best deals, and there's too much money. Like there's enough money to go around, so you are seeing more and more of them publishing their own research. Doing events is a big one, and you see a lot of like big VCs doing events now at wider crypto conferences, and then also doing smaller like initiatives, like cool, memeable things that maybe people can buy into. So a good example right now of one recently is like 1KX, like one of the VC funds. Their new website is one of the most fun websites in the whole space. The question you could ask yourself is, why have they done that? And they've done that because they enjoy it, but they've also done it because any founder looking at that will think, yeah, this is cool. Like every single person looking at it will think this is cool. And that sort of makes you want to work with that VC. You know that they understand, the memes of the space, like stuff going on. And it feels way more on brand than, the average VC website is kind of boring. So I think VCs, 1KX we've named, but, there's probably some other good ones. And finally, I think some of the biggest NFT communities have done some of the best marketing out there. But the problem is the product is lacking. So they've found community market fit and they've got these big communities, but now we're starting to see a lot of that unravel with some of the sort of mid-tier communities, is that they haven't followed up with utility and product. So it's a bit of a shame, really. And a few of them will, and most of them seem to not be doing it. So just trying to name 3 answers to this question that aren't really what we work on, because otherwise I feel it's biased. But that's the 3 types of organizations.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. So thank you everyone for listening in. You can follow Jake on Twitter. Jake, what's your Twitter? It's
at Jake_Stott, STOTT.
Perfect. And also you can follow Hype on Twitter at Hype Partners. Thank you so much.
Thanks, James.